Well, Your Holiness, we're so delighted you're back with us again for the second session. And I think that your remarks in the morning were very predictive of where we're going to be moving this afternoon, because you asked, what is the mechanism? And that's really what we're going to be talking a great deal about this afternoon, trying to go deeper into the biology, looking at not only what happens in the brain and body when stress and adversity occurs, whether in childhood or adulthood, but also what happens in brain and body when we do things to try to ameliorate that suffering and distress. So we're going to begin with Professor Davidson, who you know very well from University of Wisconsin, who's going to be talking about adverse experience in early childhood and some of the things that can be done, perhaps, to make that situation better.
Wonderful to be with you again, Your Holiness. So, Your Holiness, before we begin, I'd like to just take this opportunity to just say that there are a number of young scientists in the audience today. We're at Rockefeller University, one of the premier research institutions in the world. And the young scientists have benefited so much from your involvement in Mind and Life, your inspiration and passion for the scientific research in which we've been engaged. And on behalf of all the next generation of scientists, I want to just express our gratitude for your continuing involvement in these dialogues. I think they've been so important and so inspiring. Today, Your Holiness, I'd like to talk about some work that I've actually never had the opportunity to talk with you about before, and it's work looking at the effects of early adversity, early stress of different kinds, and how it gets under our skin and actually changes our brain function, as well as literally the very structure of the brain. And then what can we do about it? Can we use interventions, secular interventions that have been inspired by your interest in secular ethics? And can we bring that to very young children to help address some of these adverse consequences of these early stressful experiences? And what do we know about that, and how can we measure that? So that's what I'll be referring to today. So let me just start with two premises and initial conjectures. The first is that early life stress impacts the brain, and it specifically impacts the circuitry important for emotion and emotion regulation. And the second is that behavioral interventions, including those that come from contemplative traditions, can induce changes in these circuits that underlie these dimensions of emotion regulation and thereby produce meaningful behavioral change. So my talk will really be 3 points, and this is the core of everything I'm talking about. The first is that early experience modifies brain structure and function. The second is that, as Liz talked about so beautifully this morning, self-regulation in childhood predicts successful life outcomes of many different kinds. Liz talked about a very important study that I'll come back to that shows that early self-regulation predicts when an individual is in his or her 30s, it predicts their financial success, it predicts the likelihood of them using substances, illegal drugs, it predicts medical outcomes, and it actually predicts criminal convictions. That is, individuals who as children are better able to regulate themselves and their emotions end up the least likely to have any problems with the law.
So this study correlating self-regulation with
in childhood in general, or those childhood,
or is it a specific subgroup?
No, it's in general. In general,
okay.
Yes, across the spectrum. And the third point is that healthy habits.
So one would expect that children who have been exposed to stressful environment early on, would you say that one would expect them to have greater difficulty with self-regulation?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yes. And it affects their brain, and I'll show
Does
some.
it? Oh.
Yes. And the third point is that healthy habits of mind can be cultivated very early in life, and that this training can have very beneficial long-term effects. So it's not important that the details of this, hard to see here, but this is a study that we did that was published a couple of years ago with children who were physically abused in childhood. And unfortunately, there is a population of these children here in America today. And what we observed is that in these children, a part of their prefrontal cortex, which is critical for self-regulation, actually diminishes in size. It's actually smaller. And the extent to which it shrinks is actually associated with how much stress the child has in his or her life, particularly their family stress within their family, and academic stress that they experience in the academic setting. The more stress, the smaller this area of the brain, which is so important for self-regulation. And there are other studies of this kind. Other work shows that children who've been raised in Romanian orphanages in Eastern Europe have very similar changes to their brain even when they're adopted into middle-class families in the US. So these are long-term effects of this kind of early adversity. So Liz...
So these children were adopted later. So can that kind of deficiency be restored?
Well, that's a critical question, and the evidence that I'll show today suggests that we think some of the changes can be reversed with early training. So Liz showed yesterday this morning. She talked about this study of self-regulation, and one of the key aspects of self-regulation is the connection between the prefrontal cortex, which we've mentioned, and that's an area that shrinks in size with early adversity, and the amygdala, which Bruce will talk about later, and is so important for fear and stress and detection of threats in our environment. It's important for many different emotional functions, not just those, but certainly those. And there's increasing evidence that suggests that the connection between these parts of the brain is especially important. And we recently completed a study, and again, I'll explain the details here. This was a study where we followed a group of children from birth, and we tested them at many different points from birth, and the last testing point is when they're 18 years of age. And we looked at the impact of early adversity within the first year of life. And I'll say more about what that early adversity is, but it includes, for example, having a mother who is depressed and who has a difficult time with parenting. And what we see is that when...
로 친주 미치르스 말와.
So this is a longitudinal.
Yes, it's a longitudinal study.
미치부지잖아. 중도 구조 장가 가져요네. 되게 깨번네. 로쪽 깨봐.
Right.
A longitudinal study from birth to age 18 years. So when the children were 4.5 years of age, we measured a hormone that Bruce is actually one of the world's experts in, a hormone called cortisol, which is a hormone that is very critical to our basic functions. It plays a very important role in stress, but it also plays, it's important for us to have, we couldn't live without it. And so it's not just a hormone that's bad, but if it is at a very high level for a long period of time, then it can have deleterious or negative consequences. And so what we are looking at here is the connection between two parts of the brain. One is this part which is in the prefrontal cortex and a part down here which is the amygdala. And we can measure that using modern functional imaging methods, which Your Holiness has seen in the laboratory. We can measure the strength of that connection. And it turns out that individuals who have a stronger connection between those regions, meaning or implying that the prefrontal cortex is able to modulate or dampen activity in the amygdala, so the higher...
주저도 남주 소식.
남주들의 앞에 달한테 진짜한테 총용수 당선진이로 봐. 당선진이를 좋은 거 대체고. 네. 근데 대입으로 투고대 야고요나 당선진이 근데요.
Right.
So the stronger the connection, the lower the cortisol when the children were 4.5 years of age, which was cortisol taken on many different days over a period of time. Implying that there was a regulation of the stress hormone that was very adaptive. The children who had less connection between these areas of the brain had a much higher level of cortisol. Now we can ask, I circled a data point on the extreme end of the continuum. This is a child who had very high levels of cortisol and very low connection between these areas of the brain. Now, the mothers of children who were in that end were clinically depressed during the first year of life. They actually had clinical depression. The parents were fighting and arguing.
The physical emotion.
So this low connectivity, the weak connectivity between these two regions of the brain, I mean, is it something kind of more genetically inherited, or is it something to do with the environment?
We think it's mostly produced by this early environment. The environment...
Yes.
So, and this is what their environments were like. The parents were fighting and arguing in the home. They had a very critical partner who criticized them all the time. The mothers reported they were often angry with their child, and they actually reported that their child was a disappointment to them. And the mothers doubted their ability as a parent, and they reported feeling trapped. And they also reported that they didn't have enough money to make ends meet. Now, on the other end of the graph, we have individuals who have strong connection between these areas and low levels of this hormone cortisol. And they had mothers who were not depressed, were actually quite happy. They rarely fought with their spouse. They were rarely angry with their child, and they strongly disagreed with the statement, "My child is a bit of a disappointment." They strongly disagreed with that. And the mom also enjoyed being a parent, and she felt that she had some things that she could do or some time to do things that she enjoyed. And there was only occasional worry about money. So very different profile. And this is the life in the first year of the child's experience. So this is all data taken in their first year of life. So Liz showed this study this morning, and I want to just read one sentence at the end of this study, the conclusion to this study. The scientists said, interventions addressing self-control or self-regulation might reduce a panoply of societal costs, save taxpayers money, and promote prosperity. So what might those interventions be? So, Your Holiness, I'd like to now tell you about the kindness curriculum. This is a curriculum that we in our center developed for preschool children, ages 4 and 5 years of age, and we're now, Your Holiness, doing this in the Madison Public Schools with 200 children in the public school system. And this is just a list. It's 8 weeks, and we go into the classroom for 90 minutes a week, 3 30-minute periods. And before we actually do the intervention with the kids, the teachers go through 10 weeks of some simple mindfulness training that's based on our friend John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction, which Your Holiness has heard a lot about. So the teachers go through this, and then each week they go through different sections like becoming mindful of their bodies, being aware of their emotions on the inside, how to better work with problems that arise, and then cultivating kindness, and then working out problems once they've calmed down, expressing gratitude and practicing the development of positive emotions, understanding that we're all interconnected with each other and the planet, and finally ending on gratitude for our world. Now, as children go through this, these are teacher reports of pro-social behavior, such as cooperation and sharing. The blue line at the top are the children who are randomly assigned to the kindness curriculum. The purple line are the controls. And you can see over the course of 8 weeks, there's a gradual increase in the teacher reports of pro-social behavior. These are parent reports of emotion regulation from before the intervention to after. And so before, there's no difference between the groups, and after the intervention, the parents are reporting a little bit better emotion regulation just after 8 weeks. And then we developed a task to measure the impact on sharing. And what we did is to find out in each class who the child's best friend was and who the child's least favorite friend was. And we took a picture of their best friend, and we took a picture of their least favorite friend, and we put the pictures on an envelope. And we have an envelope with their best friend, an envelope with a picture of their least favorite friend, and then we have an envelope with a picture of a stranger child who the child has never seen before, but it's the same gender child. And then finally we have a picture of a sick-looking child with a bandage. And then we give the kids stickers, which kids really like at this age and is really an important currency. And we say, please distribute the stickers into the different envelopes. So we say, please distribute the stickers into the envelopes according to your preference, where you would like this to go. Before the intervention, they give most of the stickers to their best friend. The big blue line is their best friend. And they give most of the stickers to their best friend, and they distribute the remaining to the other 3 groups, but most of them go to their best friend. After 8 weeks of intervention, the distributions are totally flat. They give an equal number of stickers to the different categories of children. And while this is just stickers, I think that this is a case where it's a proof of concept that we can actually, in very young children, with a simple intervention, we can actually make a difference. So these are all the people who've contributed, and I want to just thank you, Your Holiness, for the years of inspiration for the work that we and many others are doing.
Your Holiness, I don't want to preempt any questions you might have for Professor Davidson, but if you don't have any right now, and we'll have more time for discussion,
Yes.
perhaps we would move on to our second presentation with Dr. Saron, who's going to tell you about some work that moves from the laboratory into the real life of contemplative practice.
Your Holiness, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to share our work with you again, to give you a bit of an update on what we've been doing for a number of years. And I'm very grateful for Mind and Life and all of you to have come here to partake in this feast of ideas and interchange. And as soon as the projector is on, I will.
Up in the control booth. Thank you.
Well,
Almost. There it is. Thank you.
so today, Your Holiness, I'm going to present a talk with two main points. The first point is I'm going to present a little bit of information about the design of our long-term research project, the Shamatha Project, as an example of multiple ways that we can investigate the effects of contemplative practice. We've already heard that simply focused attention meditation may produce bodily healing, may result in emotional regulation, may actually change attention. There may be many different consequences of engaging in contemplative practice. The second thing I'm going to do is to speak more directly to how such training might impact our encounter with suffering directly. So I'm going to give an overview of our research project. So in 2007, Alan Wallace. Now, Alan Wallace needs no introduction to you. He's been your student and friend for decades. But for the rest of the audience not familiar with Alan, Alan is a Buddhist scholar, author, contemplative teacher, and translator, and who we met in the 1990 Mind and Life meeting. And he had already at that time the idea that directed attention, focused attention meditation would be very amenable to scientific research, and brought the idea for an intensive project to us in UC Davis, where I work. So what we did is we created 2 3-month meditation retreats. These were full-time residential trainings in the mountains of Colorado. And we took 60 meditators and we randomly assigned half of them to the first 3-month retreat and the second 30 to a second 3-month retreat. Those in the second 3-month retreat became a control group, because, you know, not everybody can have 3 months to go full-time and meditate. So the bit of self-selected nature of the population, the control group controls for that. And we tested the control group just the same way we tested the retreat group. This age range of these retreatants was about 22 to 69. They'd all had some meditation experience. Alan's training had a primary emphasis on cultivating relaxation, the stability of attention, perceptual clarity, and one example practice is mindfulness of breathing, and for those of you who are interested, this is all described in Alan's book, The Attention Revolution. But along with the training, I don't have any earring. It's the beard, well, we could just... Okay. So along with this attention stabilization training, Alan taught 4 key attitudes for considering oneself and others: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity, or a sense of impartiality. So, since there are so many things that could be affected by such an intense training, we developed a very comprehensive set of assessments. We had daily experience questionnaires. We had a whole variety of questionnaires from social psychology about personality, different psychological traits at the beginning and end. We had structured interviews, asking people about their goals and worldviews and what it was like to meditate so much. We had attention-related laboratory tasks, attention-emotion interaction tasks, emotion-related tasks, and we also asked people to meditate in the laboratory. I'm going to talk about some emotion-related tasks. And it was a multidisciplinary study in terms of the measures we took. We used brainwave measurements. We measured autonomic nervous system activity, heart rate, skin conductance, respiration, blood pressure. We measured a startle response of the eye blink, the muscle tension response to loud sounds. We looked at performance on cognitive tasks. We looked at facial expressions of emotion. We have done thematic analysis of these interviews, what people, the different values they report. And we collected a host of biomarkers. Today I'll just talk a little bit about some autonomic measures and facial expressions. So the first experiment that I want to talk about relates to changes in your physiological response to the perception of suffering. We presented images of human suffering, and we're also going to then talk about changes in facial expression. So in an experiment that actually presented a loud sound that would produce a startle, we presented positive, neutral, and negative images. And the negative images we sorted into images of illness, loss, disease, or threatening images, violence threatened by people or threatening animals. This work is spearheaded by a graduate student in my laboratory, Brandon King. So I'm going to ask you all to prepare your minds to see some graphic images. So these are examples of images in the suffering category. These are images in the threat-related category. One of the things that we noticed at the beginning of the retreat, the control group and the retreat group have a kind of overlapping pattern of their heart rate deceleration. This is a graph that on the vertical axis, this is your heart rate slowing down, and this is a graph of time. These are seconds. And this is relative to the heart rate that you had when the picture came on in the 1 second before. After the retreat, we see a remarkable pattern. The retreatants, the trainees, have an increased deceleration. Their heart rate slows more, specifically in response to images of suffering. The groups... The control group in this blue line, they actually have a decreased response. But the groups don't differ at all in terms of the response to the threatening stimuli. What's really interesting about this is that individuals who show the pattern of heart rate deceleration when they see images of needy people actually endorse an increased desire to help. This is the work of Nancy Eisenberg, who's actually also come to Dharamsala and talked to you. So the pattern we see from this experiment is one that may relate to an increased engagement with suffering and willingness to contribute something to ameliorate it, may be in line with the development of compassion. Now I'm going to talk about another experiment where we presented emotional films and we unobtrusively videotaped people and we coded their facial expressions using your friend Paul Ekman's coding system that he developed with Wally Friesen. And this is also going to be some difficult to see images. Here is an image of a woman watching the scene on the left. These are from a documentary about the Iraq War. This work is spearheaded by Erica Rosenberg, who has talked with you at Stanford. Tony Zanesco and Brandon King, also graduate students in the lab. Here's another image. Here's an image of a soldier talking about how difficult it was to encounter the suffering of families, husbands carrying dead children, dead wives. So what's our hypothesis? We think that after the training in focused attention and these key attitudes, we're going to have less of a pushing away of suffering, more of an ability to encounter it without defensiveness. So we think and by pushing away, we specifically mean reactions of anger, disgust, and contempt. And in its place, we expect more of sadness. Because what is the natural response to seeing this kind of suffering? So here is an example of a sad face of this woman. And these numbers correspond to just 12 seconds of coding using the facial action coding system. Every single video frame that there is a movement on the face is noted, the muscle group that contracts is noted, its intensity and its offset. And we take this database of facial expression and put it into a dictionary for co-occurring muscle movements that define different emotional expressions. So what do we see in terms of sadness? We had another film that we showed before the retreat began, at the beginning, for both groups. And before the retreat, both the trainee and the control groups do not differ in how likely they are to show sadness, or if they show sadness, how many sadness expressions they have. After the retreat, it's more likely for retreatants, for the trainees, to show sadness expressions. The groups do not differ in how many expressions they show, if they do show. But 20% of the control group showed sadness after 3 months, and 50% of the retreat group, the trainees, showed sadness. So after training, they're more likely to show sadness. What about rejection emotions? Before the retreat, there are no differences between the groups on rejection emotions, either in likelihood or the number of responses. after the retreat, they were equally likely to show a rejection emotion. About 70% of all participants showed anger, contempt, or disgust. But the trainees showed significantly fewer of these emotional expressions.
That wasn't very clear.
Okay.
Say that again.
Okay, so what in terms of sadness, we're talking about likelihood.
That was fine. So
Here,
yeah.
both groups do show some rejection, but the trainee group, the retreatants, show less number of expressions. So there's fewer rejection expressions overall. Maybe. Okay. So we could summarize by saying less rejection emotions after training. We now look at what people say. Okay? So now we're going to ask people what they felt when they were showing sadness. And this is sort of my final point. After people saw the film, we showed them a kind of storyboard, a set of pictures from the film, and we knew when they reported that what they were feeling every 2 seconds of the film when their emotions changed. And we looked at what they said they were feeling when they showed expressions of sadness. After the retreat, trainees reported significantly higher ratings of sympathy and distress, but not higher ratings of sadness. The sadness expression does not directly refer to the feeling of sadness. It refers to the feeling of sympathy. Well, there was no relationship between sadness expressions and sympathy ratings in the control group. So this is my final point here. The findings throw into question the meaning of this sadness expression after training in compassion. It suggests that they may be markers of a training-related growth of other-directed empathic concern. And that's what I want to tell you about today. So I have an extraordinary team of scientists at Davis and elsewhere, a whole host of consulting scientists, some of whom are here, and I'm incredibly grateful, as we all are, for our generous funding. Thank you.
Your Holiness, with your permission, I think we would like to move on to the third presentation. Then we'll save all of our time at the end for the discussion and questions. Is that okay with you?
Yes.
Dr. McCune.
Can you all hear me? Not yet. Okay, is that better? All right. Your Holiness, your belief in science and what it has to offer has been an inspiration to me and to all of us. And I'm very much honored and pleased that we could host this event here at the Rockefeller University. What I have to tell you is going more deeply into the brain and the phenomenon that we call stress. And I have 2 points to make. One is to talk a little more about the good as well as the bad side of stress, and even more importantly, to talk about the plasticity and resilience of the brain and some of the circuits in the brain that you've already heard about from Richie Davidson. Okay, click. So you're going to see this slide again many times, but what we should look at first is the middle, the brain, which is the central organ of stress and adaptation. It is where memories are stored, where the lived experience is stored, where it then has effects on our behavior and also on the rest of the body, downwards through the physiologic responses of systems like the ability to produce cortisol. And from left to right at the bottom, this notion, which is called allostasis, emphasizes the idea that these responses, like our cortisol response, being able to turn it on and then turn it off again, is part of what leads us to adapt to stressors, to new situations. And at the very bottom in yellow is this concept that we call allostatic load, which is really just a way of saying that those same mediators, like cortisol, when they are overused, when there's too much of them, or when they are dysregulated with respect to other mediators, they contribute to disease. And so the goal is to maximize adaptation and minimize those negative effects of stress, of the response to stress. Now, if we look at the secretion of cortisol, the brain, of course, controls that secretion through the pituitary gland. Cortisol comes from the adrenal gland. And on the right, in the red, emphasizing the fact that when cortisol is released in response to an acute stress, it actually enhances the ability of the immune system to defend our bodies. It improves certain aspects of memory, like to avoid something that might be dangerous. It promotes replenishment of energy supplies and more efficient cardiovascular function. But when cortisol is overproduced, or when we give cortisol, perhaps intentionally, it can suppress immune function, suppress inflammation. It also can impair memory. And when it's produced chronically, it can promote bone mineral loss and even wasting of muscles, and contributes to what we call the metabolic syndrome, which is related to diabetes and other conditions which are very, unfortunately, all too prevalent in modern life. Now, what you see here is the DNA double helix, and this notion of epigenetics refers to this important idea that we've had for a long time, that the environment controls the expression of our genetic code, and without changing the code itself. But there are various ways in which the genes that we have are their ability to be expressed are altered by chemical changes in parts of the DNA itself, but also in proteins which are able to bind to the DNA and either make it unfold and express its information, or actually become repressed. And actually, here at the Rockefeller University, I was lucky enough to be a student in the laboratory of pioneers in this area, Vincent Alfrey and Alfred Mirsky, and currently David Alice is one of our professors who is a world's expert in this area of epigenetics. And cortisol also affects this process. So here we see this slide again, in which it highlights the different kinds of stressors. We have, of course, trauma and abuse, major life events like death, birth, divorce, loss of job, and we have the daily hassles of our working and living and neighborhood and national and international environment. Now to go a little bit further, since stress is an ambiguous term, and some people think of it in a more positive way, there is something we can call positive stress, where, like we're doing now, giving a talk, hopefully having a good reception of the talk, feeling exhilarated from a successful outcome. In order to do that, we have to basically have good self-esteem, a good sense of mastery and control, having experience, and having internally good brain architecture that enables us to do this. Then there's tolerable stress. And tolerable stress is when something bad happens, adverse life events. But we have that good brain architecture. We have the external and internal resources. We have support from family and friends. We have adequate financial resources. And we can weather the storm. And we have resilience and we can recover. And then there's something called toxic stress, which almost speaks for itself. And toxic stress may be related to having somewhat insufficient brain architecture that doesn't enable us to have these positive features. It may also be a reflection of early life abuse and neglect that we've heard about, and poor or very limited support from friends, family, and of course financial limitations. And that brings us to the adverse childhood experiences studies that were done by our Centers for Disease Control, but they were done in the Kaiser Permanente health system in California, which is a middle-class population. So what we're talking about is not just the plight of poor people, but the plight of our middle class. And I think it's, of course, increasing concern worldwide that we're all under a lot of stress. And on the left, besides what we've already mentioned, such as verbal abuse and financial worries, living in a single-parent family, having an alcoholic family member, having one member of the family incarcerated in prison, depression in the family, neglect by the caregivers, and of course physical and sexual abuse. The more of this there is, and there is an ACE score, the higher is the incidence later in life of heart disease, of the propensity to smoke, of obesity, of drug abuse, higher risk for acquiring AIDS, major depression, anxiety, anger control, and antisocial behavior. So this is a major, major contributor to the diseases of modern life. Now, talking about, it's not just the stressful experiences, but also our lifestyle, the behaviors we engage in on a daily basis in order to accommodate. The term stressed out really means that, because we often feel overwhelmed, out of control, exhausted, anxious, frustrated, angry. And what happens? We may lose sleep at night. We've heard also mentioned, I think Liz Nielsen mentioned today, about the sleep deprivation of having a harsh boss, or shorter sleep, eating too many of the wrong things, drinking alcohol in excess, smoking.
你可是不是？按照啊。Yes.
And also neglecting the regular physical activity that we know is important to us. So all of these contribute to this wear and tear on the body that I called allostatic load, the price that the body pays for these conditions. So it's not just the experiences but it's how we deal with them in terms of our behavior. And then we come to the brain. And we talk about brain regions. But before that, we talk about the fact that we have nerve cells on the left that have dendrites that are receiving information from other nerve cells. It turns out that these dendrites can grow or shrink. They can become more complex, develop more connections, or shrink and develop fewer connections. In the middle, this is where the synaptic connections are, the information through this chemical neurotransmission. These synapses turn over. They are formed and replaced during our adult life and as a result of experience of various kinds, stressful and not. And then on the right, there's a limited amount of neurogenesis that occurs throughout adult life in areas of the brain, particularly in this area you've already heard about called the hippocampus. So the ability to generate new nerve cells in adult life is very important. It turns out it's enhanced by exercise. It can be suppressed by lack of exercise or also by certain stressors. So we may have more or fewer nerve cells in this particular brain area because of this. You're going to see this again in various forms, but I'm going to talk briefly about 3 areas of the brain. The hippocampus, which is important for memory and also for mood regulation. It's important for shutting off the stress response that we've heard about. And it undergoes the shrinkage and loss of nerve cells, loss of neurogenesis under chronic stress. The amygdala is the brain area that's involved in anxiety, fear, and aggression. It also turns on the production of stress hormones, increases heart rate, increases that stress response. And one part of the amygdala actually, under the same kind of chronic stress that causes the hippocampal nerve cells to shrink, these nerve cells expand and become more connected, and fear and anxiety increase as a result. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, which we've already heard about in the context of self-regulatory behaviors. That's the important brain region for that. It's involved in self-regulatory behaviors, also in decision-making, working memory, various kinds of impulse control. And it also shuts off the stress response, works with the hippocampus. And it tends to show a shrinkage of dendrites and loss of synapses with chronic stress. It's also one of the last brain areas to fully develop as a child grows older. And it's that growth and formation of these connections which is very important for the development of these self-regulatory behaviors that we've heard about. So what we have then with stress, the good and the bad side, acutely stress can help us remember better. It can, but more severe acute stress can actually have inhibitory effects, so we have this U-shaped curve. We also have adaptive plasticity, which I talked about, this shrinkage, which, by the way, is largely reversible in a healthy brain if you stop the stress. In a brain that has a depressive or anxiety disorder, the ability to come back, to rebound, the resilience may be limited or even lacking. And then finally, the bad side is when we have a seizure, a stroke, or a head trauma. Then there's permanent, irreversible loss of nerve cells. And ironically, the cortisol, the glucocorticoid, and the transmitters that help the good side are actually involved in causing this permanent, irreversible damage. So it's, again, how do we promote the good side and minimize the bad side? So the hippocampus under stress shows shrinkage in major depression, in type 2 diabetes, which is, of course, a worldwide problem, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also in Cushing's disease, where the body is producing too much cortisol. The good news is that at least in Cushing's disease, and perhaps also in depression, if we treat it, there may be at least partial reversal of some of this shrinkage and improvement of mood and improvement of memory. But in our modern lives, without disease, we know that a long-time history of chronic stress may lead to a smaller hippocampus and impaired function, that chronic jet lag, traveling without having adequate time between trips, will lead to shrinkage of the hippocampus and memory impairment, that lack of exercise is associated with smaller hippocampus, and that chronic inflammation, which is part of all the diseases of modern life, is associated with a smaller hippocampus. But let's then talk about the good side and what we can do about it. And so we'll talk very briefly about regular physical activity, social support and integration, and cognitive behavioral therapies, especially mindfulness-based stress reduction. In the case of the hippocampus, we know that regular exercise, I'll give you an example in a moment, intense learning, right, intense learning, and also antidepressant treatments, including exercise, will actually benefit the hippocampus and in some cases will actually enlarge it. Now this is a recent study by a group at the University of Illinois. Elderly subjects who were sedentary walked an hour a day, 5 out of 7 days a week. And over the space of a year, on the top, both their left and their right hippocampus got larger, presumably in part because there were new neurons produced, but also perhaps because of other changes in the dendrites and other kind of things. But a real significant increase and improvement of the behaviors that are dependent on the hippocampus. The amygdala, which you've heard about, which we know becomes overactive in anxiety disorders and depression. There is a study using a mindfulness-based stress reduction from the Harvard Mind-Body Center that actually shows on the right-hand side there's a perceived stress scale that measures your sense of being stressed out. And what it shows is that people who show reductions in their anxiety and their perceived stress actually show larger volumes of the amygdala, which is something we might predict on the basis of some studies on animal models. But this also illustrates the important point. We have to use subjects as their own controls and measure changes in the brain in relation to changes in their behavior. And finally, the prefrontal cortex, which really is probably one of the most important structures we've been talking about in terms of these self-regulatory behaviors. On the right is a list of many of the negative things that are involved: impaired function from chronic perceived stress or jet lag, impaired development from early life adversity, neglect, or chaos in the home setting, resulting in poor self-regulatory behaviors that we've already talked about. One study, again using a mindfulness-based stress reduction scheme, took people who had chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a very mysterious but very debilitating disease, found that those people who benefited in terms of reduced symptoms showed enlargement of their prefrontal cortical gray matter volume, which again suggests you follow the same subjects and that behavior actually may change the brain. And finally, Liz Nielsen spoke this morning about the Experience Corps, this very important program of having volunteers. Study actually involving some of the same people who did the exercise study and who've also shown improvements in prefrontal cortical function with regular exercise, found that the activity of being a volunteer in the Experience Corps, which involves increased physical activity, but also making friends and feeling meaning and purpose in life, actually improved prefrontal cortical function. So really the message then in this final slide, which I showed you earlier, is the question of, can we harness this intrinsic plasticity and resilience of the brain, and how does it fit into what we're discussing today? How would we take advantage of it in relation to the things that that we all feel are important? Thank you very much.
Well, sincere thanks to each of our three presenters. And Your Holiness, you've been hearing about the effects of stress, particularly early stress, on the brain and multiple bodily systems, their relationship to disease, and some of the things often based on mindfulness kinds of practices that might be able to change this for the better. And we wonder about whether, from your perspective, you think there are more important, or what are the most important of social or relationship factors that can influence well-being as we grow, reach adulthood and age?
It's very difficult to generalize in these kind of situations. So His Holiness was saying that maybe he would expect to see differences from individual to individual. In some cases, because of some genetic inheritance or whatever, there may be situations where, if as a result of adverse stress in early childhood, the damage could be so severe that probably there is no possibility of reversing it. So generally speaking, yeah.
I have one question. My own sort of curiosity. You mentioned the jet lag.
Jet lag.
Jet lag. This is for me. You see, time zone change.
Oh yes,
no disturbance about my sleep.
Okay.
No, it's a new place. Now, for example, from Delhi up to here, 9 hours differences. But then reach here, set up is local time. Then local time, about 6:37, I feel asleep. Then next morning, around 3, wake up. No problem. Now the stomach clock.
That's true.
Won't listen.
Yeah.
No?
Yes.
So time change, then this system irregular. So seems to see sleep, although physical sort of what's today, elements involved, but seems to see some closer connection with the mind, mental.
Yep.
So mental level, a set of time, then sleep goes according to that time. The physical
Doesn't.
won't be about mind. Its own sort of independent sort of clock or something like that. Right. So do you think some sort of the scientific
is there any scientific explanation for this?
Well, the cortisol rise is what is organized by our circadian clock, the clock in our brain, and actually all cells of the body, that actually has to be shifted so that we can adjust to a different time zone. And that clock early in the morning is, among other things, turning on our cortisol secretion. So it goes up and it actually gets us hungry for our breakfast, and it makes us more active. So it's part of that which gets us ready for the next day. Now that only really changes. You can make it change more rapidly by exposure of the head to bright sunlight. Some people think melatonin is a chemical that a hormone that we can use, but that really is the important biological element that needs time to shift in the right way.
Just a biological factor.
So His Holiness's question is this: his sleep cycle seems to
and the sleep cycles seem to be
amenable to his own,
and also related to the brain. Oh.
Right, and that I mean, I think as long as your stomach isn't growling too much, then you may be able to get a normal night's sleep. I'm not able to offer an explanation other than the fact, as you said yourself, that there is a higher cognitive process that enables you to make that sleep process occur independently of these other physiologic issues.
I don't think our stomachs are as smart as our brains.
That's true. Less complicated. This is very complicated. Yes.
Mind training. We do mind training, not stomach training.
Your Holiness, I'd like to ask of you, each of the speakers made reference to training based upon mindfulness. In the traditions in which meditation has been practiced, it's always been a part of other things as well. From your perspective, is mindfulness or meditation practice enough, or must there be other things that go along with it?
Energy side, mind the energy side. Tago, under the Zijibe, Jigda, Hasoda, Semnes or Shines or Dingin the Druins and some Korean genre. That energy like Kuyachi. That the Zolungiam yoga.
So, of course, there are different forms of practices such as mindfulness and shamatha, which tend to operate more on the level of application of attention. So they are more cognitively oriented and mental. However, there are other practices which are less mental, but more involves application of
I think this morning
energy.
I mentioned mind, its own sort of ability is knowing. Then energy carry movement. So it's two ways. Control destructive emotion. On the level of mind itself, it's a training, try to familiarize loving kindness, these things. Then the anger, these reduce. This is one way. Then another, since anger also is combined with certain energy. So you see, try to control the energy, the intensity of anger reduce. Different way. Here, the physical or physical, the yoga training.
So the second part of the approach is more kind of yoga-based and more kind of physiological processes.
Physical exercise.
For example, in your example, you talked about the elderly walking for an hour. So that effect is really coming from the more physiological route than mental.
I would like to carry one examination. Two persons, more or less same age, 1 hour long, one hour long walk. One, during walk, there's a lot of anger. Another 1 hour walk, more sort of peaceful, sort of
calm state.
Because of that.
Calm state of mind.
Calm state of mind. Then what differences?
Well, it's possible also that the walking may calm that one person down, possibly. But also, I think you bring up a very important point, because if one forces somebody to walk, it does not have the benefits for brain function that voluntarily walking, and I think your point about what's going on in the mind is very important. But the other aspect of this, in the best possible state where one is voluntarily walking, physically active, does it open up the brain, facilitate the plasticity of the brain, and then does it make mindfulness and other practices more effective? That was actually going to be one of the questions I was going to ask you, because we regard these things as facilitators.
That's very true. In fact, in the tradition, there is a recognition that, for example, switching from a more agitative state of mind directly onto a more wholesome state is, not possible. So, in order to get to a more very difficult. So, to move on to a
not possible though to yes. I think someone who something very familiar, you see these things, then within seconds you can shift.
So it's
more difficult. Ordinary people.
So ordinary people, it's more difficult. So you need an intervening period where from the agitated, disturbed state of mind, you try to get to a more neutral state of mind, and then move on to a wholesome state of mind. And this transitional kind of process is generally effected through some form of exercises, so which in the tradition would include a specific breathing, active breathing exercises to get you to that state, and then move on to meditation practices.
Okay. One of the implications of what Bruce is saying is that a number of the methods that have been found to produce changes in the brain are methods that induce increased plasticity. But increased plasticity in and of itself is neither necessarily good or bad. It depends on what that plasticity is being used for. And so when stressful experiences occur, it's through plasticity that the brain can be changed in a negative way. And I think one of the interesting implications of Bruce's question is there may be methods like walking which may induce plasticity, may increase plasticity, and if it is combined with a practice that cultivates a wholesome state of mind, that may actually be particularly beneficial, and it may actually help the cultivation of a healthy state of mind to also be engaged in a strategy which at the same time promotes plasticity, because it would increase the opportunity for learning.
That's true.
So this actually ties back to what I'd like to request of Al for a further clarification of what you meant by other things. Because I'm not clear whether we were talking about different specific meditation practices, or you are actually pointing to a much larger question, which has to do with an ethical framework and a kind of spiritual worldview in which to situate a commitment to contemplative practice. Was that what the other things
Yes,
were?
Both.
Okay, so that is a different...
Bena, 지금 소수비에 매바여서 그베여서 지리야. bena 지금 제집에 대바치았어지. 대바 모디 집어체.
네.
그다. 다 대바 ben다 가서 그러나. 지금 다음에 대바, 먼저지 대바, 이지 대바. 야 대바식 먼저다 용기여야 돼. 진짜다. 키시 사소식. 천안당에 깨비 사소식 대바 집어체. 이내다 대바도 용서디 다 싫어 단 담을 먹고 싶지 떠든 담을 먹고 싶지 언제 걸어 이내 떠든 담을 뒤도 만들지 고 대바 찍고 지고 수산이 그 샤도로 그 투모를 줘대도 와 자자가 그 인포메이션 용서디 별로 내는 게 담아디 싫어 근데 땡중을 따와서 되나 용서디 남외식는 용버리티 티 남외치도 제가 하면 또 과리 있는 건 줘대도 와 되는 말씀
So to respond to this more specific question about kind of, in other words, decontextualizing these kind of practices from their sources, His Holiness was making the point that, for example, if you look at the role of faith and the importance of faith in different traditions, you see kind of a certain universality. The object of the faith may be different to whom you cultivate that faith. And the sources from which this faith arises may be different. In some individuals, it arises out of understanding, through reason, critical reflection. In some, it would be more of a devotional, kind of approach. But in the faith itself is a mental state, and it can be independent from any specific sources from which it arises. So similarly, these meditation practices may, come from certain cultural kind of milieu, and you take it out of context, but in themselves, there can be a universality. So His Holiness was saying that he often cites the example of the principle of dependent or interdependence, which in its philosophical formulation really comes mainly in the Buddhist sources. But the principle of interdependence can be applied, in other secular domains, such as environment. So, in itself, it's a kind of a more universal principle. So, from where it comes from and its universality, maybe, so one can see that way.
It's really interesting that the first word that enters in this dialogue is faith, because that's not a word we often hear when we're talking about mindfulness.
Mindfulness ke shebe ko theba ti ngu bindos den kun tin theba pe chon ko ete
네, 비드백을 전식만.
So it's just
Better than Kagaro.
it's just an example.
But it may be very critical to have, in fact, a sense of strong belief in the inquiry, a faith that the practice is actually going to be fruitful.
I think millions of scientists, cause of many more laboratory research, the research thoroughly investigate I
mean, faith does play a role, as Holiness is saying, that there are thousands of scientists out there, and not every of them is going to repeat every single fact that they are going to subscribe to.
I didn't say that
they
faith
will
is not
subscribe to
critical.
someone like Richie's word and trust him for
So
his.
some form of faith is there.
Faith in the
You see
data.
different, that different aspect, right? Faith, different aspect. I think children, you see, listen. The parents, good parents, advice. Simply faith.
It's trust. I think problem
Trust.
is coming from the English translation. The term is sometimes trust and sometimes faith. That was it.
The easy,
Long.
trust.
Very-
One, the faith with trust.
very-
Another, faith, desire. One
very- In the form of an admiration,
no.
in the form of aspiration, wanting to achieve that. Yeah.
Another sort of faith,
In the form of admiration.
so different.
Your Holiness, there is a development.
So His Holiness was saying that his usage of the word faith was not entirely out of context.
Oh, yes, okay.
I was just going to mention that part of this, there's a well-known developmental psychologist at Stanford who has studied a children's capacity or children's belief or faith in the changeability of their own mind. And it turns out that if a child believes that she or he could change, their capacity to change is dramatically enhanced. And so
수술이야 놀라 요도 줘요. 이제 진짜 보고 줘나. 아니 땡땡 거 이거 딱 보여 보시다. 다 나를 지라시라 요도 해 삼삼지. 야견 로야리야. 지 이제 몇 년 되더니 같이.
Did
That's true.
that easy that 가서 convictions 그래.
Trust, convictions.
Conviction. that 김전 잡아 타마디 이지가 리군데.
So even where the route that we go through critical reason, critical inquiry, at the end of the critical inquiry, you need to trust what you discover.
Actually, you see, aim is some kind of conviction. Conviction which goes very well with reality. Some conviction based on appearances. So that conviction is dangerous. We must know the reality thoroughly. Then is the firm sort of conviction. That's that kind of conviction based on reason, investigation. Now I think that those well-known, genuine, open-minded scientists, years investigate. Through their investigation, their finding is now something definite. Trust.
So this is something that we can trust.
So 대화. easy conviction.
Very conviction.
Everyone, I want to make sure we reserve enough time for Your Holiness to make closing comments. But I also wanted to be able to ask Mathieu a question. It's very clear what contemplatives have contributed to the science that we've been talking about. but I'm curious about what it is that the science has contributed, if anything at all, to contemplatives.
그래서
내가 간다 남배면에 제리볼 파샵 쇼도샤스 남버조데 제리볼 좀 배가도
So,
맨제 문평에서 다 강에 제거.
His Holiness is saying that one of the Tibetan Buddhist practices involved repeating 100,000. It's a part of the preliminary practice where you repeat the mandala offering, which is offering of the cosmos, which is based on the Abhidhamma cosmology of Mount Meru centered with a flat earth. So then you repeat that formula 100,000 times. So His Holiness was saying that one of the benefits is the casualty of that cosmology.
사사가 이제 등인지 좀. 내가 이지미스 내가 러러 행하시고 계신 저지스. 또는 맨제편 팽이요 이렇게 말했어.
So His Holiness was saying that actually once when he spoke about his own lack of, faith in the Abhidhamma cosmology, which is Mount Meru centered, and how he does not accept that anymore. And then one, person actually asked him, in that case, you don't believe, in that case, is there no benefit in making mandala offering ritual? So he responded that the point of making a mandala offering is to offer the entire cosmos. So regardless of whether they are owned or unowned, everything, so still there will be benefits. So it's not only the exposure So it's not only the exposure to modern cosmology and astronomy that question the veracity of the Abhidhamma, Mount Meru-centered cosmos, but in fact, even independent of exposure to contemplative cosmology, even within the Buddhist resources, if you look at the description of the cosmos in very different texts, there are conflicting accounts of the cosmos. So they are all talking about the same reality, but they are conflicting accounts. And furthermore, in the Buddhist philosophy, we often use epistemological and logical arguments, forms of argument, where by observing facts that are contrary to certain phenomena, you can then disprove certain claims. And similarly, in some context, non-observance can be a proof of its absence. So when in relation to critiquing others' position, classical Buddhist texts use these observance of contrary facts and non-observance. So since we use these forms of logic and reasoning when critiquing others' standpoint, you cannot then pretend that your own position is immune to that kind of reasoning. So through these methods too, one can question the veracity of the Abhidhamma cosmos.
What about the contemplative science as it's grown over the last 20 years, given this collection of efforts and the interest in the room, the distributed consequences of all of the studies of contemplative practice, how is that benefiting the tradition?
남배 신문하러 저자 대신 치기 생리 다들 신문에 저 생리 다들은 남근남샤 되는 대비남샤지 다 남근남샤 남다 또 먹고 싶다 지금 근데 이전에 가다 시내주 단을 보도잖아요 무한감을 repoti 생리도 쉬우지 판다고 모두 사이언스 다 생각을 repoti 야 타주요 그래 다 뒤로네 아주 생리부터 파 판다치고 가서 판다치고 그래 선진자로 주시 판다요 수시
그래서 공부도 리서치 개인기 투표야 가려서
저는 단디 가요라 영어는 이미 통교
So His Holiness was saying that he
주주
often
돌아라 해보시 세 주주 돌아서 저러시 무슨 저선 깔래 되지더니 점배서 되버리 있는 저스입니다
he
더
often,
판도 이미 통할 거 없다
you know,
This sounds good.
he often makes distinctions between three kind of broad elements on the contents of the classical Buddhist sources. On the one element has to do with understanding the nature of reality. So there is an element of science in the Buddhist texts as well, whether it is related to external cosmos or the nature of mind or mental processes,
Or particle.
or even particle
quantum physics
particle physics and so on the one hand. So that has to do with the description of the understanding of nature of reality. So, and then the second element has to do with Buddhist philosophy, which is an understanding, an inquiry into the ultimate nature of reality. And then based upon these two,
not only
there's-
ultimate reality but also now for example the concept of impermanence ultimate reality
Yes. So the reasoning and inquiry into the philosophical dimensions, and then based upon these two, then there is the Buddhist practice and religion. So, and because of this, through the dialogue with scientists, in the area of understanding the physical universe, of course the Buddhist side benefits tremendously because of the sophistication in the scientific understanding. And then in the mental domain, Buddhism probably has quite a lot to offer to contemporary science. And looking at the contemplative research, one thing that the Buddhists can gain from this is to really understanding the efficacy of some of these practices, so that at least at the individual level, meditators can feel we are not wasting our time. And His Holiness was saying that otherwise, people who commit themselves to 3-year retreat may start to doubting, does this really work?
좀
Then, otherwise they become kind of self-imposed prisoners.
Matthew, do you wish to add anything to that?
Yeah, you have to.
Well, in the beginning, I was, when some of our scientist colleagues were asking me, how does that change the way you practice in your hermitage? And I was trying to be polite, but in the very beginning, certainly, I knew what kind of practice my teachers have taught me. So I was not basically, when I was going back to my hermitage, I was basically following the traditional course of practice and didn't change much. I didn't change my schedules or my way of practicing. But there are some insight, definitely, which gradually I gained from this collaboration on related directly to the practice. And just to give you a very short example, in modern psychology, we speak of loving kindness, of empathy, which is, of course, there are many definitions, but one of them, especially in neuroscience, is affective resonance. If someone is joyful, you feel very happy. If someone is very sad, there's some element of sadness. It was shown in the brain that if you see pain and you resonate with the pain area in the brain is activated. This is actually also your pain. So the question was for compassion, which is, compassion is supposed to be loving, the love applied to suffering, the wish that may suffering and the cause be removed. Do you need to feel? I remember Paul Ekman insistently asking me, do you need to feel the suffering of others or not? And it was a bit puzzling because sometimes the sight of suffering is extremely moving, and sometimes some of our teachers, like Caspary Moshe, who is know very well, when he was told about very sad news, you could see that very great depth, incredible depth of compassion, but you would not see a strong emotional display on his face. So we were totally convinced personally that his compassion was immense, but he would not show extreme display of sadness or whatever. So it may vary. So I was thinking, how can we better understand and reply to the scientists? So once I was with Tanya Singer, who's another neuroscientist who's part of the board of Mind and Life, and we were trying to see if we could make it differently. So first of all, when I was trying to meditate on compassion, in the scanner, she was looking at what's going on, and we were doing real-time fMRI when you can see, and she says, what are you doing? This is not what we usually see when someone empathizes with someone's suffering. So then we talked more, and we said, well, maybe the sort of resonance with suffering is what triggers compassion, but maybe compassion has another dimension. So now, how to distinguish those, which we don't necessarily do in the Hermitage, we say, well, let's do for 1 hour just empathic resonance with suffering. So I was remembering some very dramatic images I had seen the day before on the BBC of orphans from the Romanian place where they were so weak, they were barely taken care, even walking sometimes they would break their bones, they were sitting like that. Extreme sufferings. Images of people trapped in earthquakes. So I did that for a whole hour, trying to just feel that, focused on that, and not, try to bring the loving kindness and compassion, almost pushing it away as far as it's possible, but just really focus again and again on the suffering. And within an hour, I felt like this was unbearable. I mean, what we call burnout, that means the emotional sort of weariness and exhaustion that comes from resonating with suffering that caregivers might have day after day after day. And we know that 60% of doctors and nurses have this burnout. They cannot stand it anymore. So sometimes they choose to distance themselves, which of course not the right solution, because if you become cold emotionally, you basically treat patient as client or whatever, so it is like the human dimension. So then at the end of this 1 hour, our friend Tanya Singer said, we want to take a lunch break, or you want to start the compassion aspect. I said, please, I want to start the compassion. This is too much, this feeling of distress. So that's why I was a bit puzzled by that. And then when sort of I tried the best I could to generate, embracing love and compassion and human warmth and loving kindness, of trying to pervade the suffering with love and compassion, I felt completely different. Instead of this sort of anxiety and deep sort of discomfort, I feel more like all embracing with a very positive attitude, like a mother will take a sick child and try to comfort him. So a very, very different state of mind. And then in the brain, it was obviously very different. I mean, areas which had to do with anxiety, like the amygdala, were turned off. There's some areas which has to do with what they call rewards. I would not call it reward myself, but a very wholesome state of mind were activated, positive emotions. So then come the idea, could we use that for, caregivers? So there's a long study that's going to go on, but to make it short, a preliminary study showed if you take anyone, 2 groups and separate them randomly, and one will do just trying to do this empathy training for 1 week. After 1 week, they reported that they were seeing suffering everywhere, even going at the workplace. They saw suffering all over the place, to the extent that it was actually affecting them. And we had to add 1 day of loving kindness training to put the balance back. But the group that did just loving kindness, when they were exposed to suffering, they saw not positively, but with the positive emotions and sense of courage rather than discouragement. So in a way, that study with what we call meditators or practitioners, that we try to figure out how those two relate, that was also new for us. And just to conclude, in the teachings we say that we must contemplate the suffering of the beings, and then there is unbearable, like misopa. And so, but maybe before bringing the compassion, maybe we should do a little bit more extended, so that we really feel strongly the unbearable aspect of suffering, and then the compassion will be probably much more genuine, much greater than just thinking of suffering and immediately sort of wishing that the suffering may be out. So that's one element, for instance, which I became much more clear to my limited understanding by interacting with the research. Thank you.
Galado Suyadiri, the Ninji and Diti, and the Junju Naya Topot Lansarje, Ninji Tunga Manju Sensung Shadi. That the land in Ninjilia, Tidwa, Nancy Fire watching Lui, Casuli, Lui Caver, Charging Shirok, Shirok Caver, and Ninji Moment. The Bena Simpsons only Benji, Chulami Benji, minimum Benjis, Chishik. That in a Ninja Kore, Dishirok, Talk Kavaki, that talk Janki, that talk. The talk Kavaki, talk Janki, that in a Zoji Trisha. Hangsam renew Ninjiti, Gomdu Ninji. That the Dumele China, some melody, Jidaning share, Dumele Dandulo share. That the Dumele Tuya, Dengsu came back. That Dumele Tuya, Dengsu you think Ninjil is an Gomdu Ninji. That the Nindo, how to the Shimurto. Just a chisel with Dumeton, Nindo Parma, Nindo Shunam.
So what Matula said is really very true. Therefore, in the Buddhist sources, when we read about compassion, there are many different kinds of compassion mentioned. For example, there is the simple compassion elicited by the sight of others suffering. And there are other forms of compassion where the compassion is reinforced by the wisdom component of understanding that, certain reality of that situation. And even we speak of non-objectifying or non-referential compassion, where the compassion is very strong, but it has no element of grasping or clinging. So these are descriptions of compassion from the point of view of different complementary factors. But even in the compassion itself, one can speak of two types of compassion. One is a simple wish to see the object of your concern to be free from suffering. The other one is a more courageous form of compassion, where actually not only you wish the person to be free, but you want to bring that about, the elevation of suffering. So this second level of compassion has a much greater sense of courage, and you wanted to do something. And in this second type of compassion, the more you are exposed to suffering, the greater courage you acquire. Instead of being overwhelmed and distressed, the sight of suffering enhances your courage and the wish to do something about
it.
So of course it's easy to talk about them, but it's very difficult to actually experience and cultivate them.
Your Holiness, I know you must leave quite soon, but I wonder whether you have some closing comments, things you would like to say before you have to depart for the day.
I know nothing. I really enjoy, and I always say enjoy this kind of meeting. It's actually education for myself. Then sometimes while explaining, experts explain their own sort of field.
Research.
While I listen, some questions come. Then, when the presentation finished, all these questions disappear. And I am quite lazy, just make note. So in any way, whenever I participate in this kind of meeting, I really learned many new things, useful things. So thank you very much. And those people, I usually say mentioning this kind of sort of research work, two aims. One aim, simply understanding about reality, or scientific sort of research expand. Till recent, the modern science, their field, mainly physical field, physical world. not much pay attention about inner world. Now like this, and these people are really now showing more interest about our inner world. It is necessary. Our health, happy family, happy society, global level, happy humanity. Ultimately related with our inner peace, inner value. So they now, I think, carry research, scientists carry research work more holistic. That's so wonderful. So knowledge expand. That's one thing. Another thing, from our knowledge, from because of our findings, how can we contribute for better world, happier world? I think from religious sort of side, I think last, almost 4,000 years, religious side, they try to improve humanity. But some benefit, but overall humanity is concerned, I think I may say fail. So now, the modern science, I think should fill the modernity.
Fill where there's a gap.
I just mentioned when separate education institutions started in the European continent about 1,000 years ago. At that time, the moral ethics taken care by church. So more or less balance. So a newly established education institution taking care only brain. Now, the influence of church will reduce. And also the society becoming more multi-religious sort of community. Or look, humanity, then multi-religious humanity. So logically, religion now cannot cover, any religion cannot cover entire humanity. So we must find new way to approach these moral ethics. And that also, you see, such sort of person, you see, stated, and we must believe that. It's a wrong approach. We must prove through scientific sort of because of the research. So then the data is like this is a presentation. It's really convincing. Then based on these things, then educate people from kindergarten up to university level about moral ethics. That, I think, another sort of purpose or goal of our meeting. Then we really makes a contribution for a better world from your sort of marvelous knowledge out of research work. And then very good. Otherwise, you see, all those knowledge, you see, keep here and then eventually buried in coffin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Secular ethics.
Okay.
Endorsement.
He wants.
The secular ethics was a scientific.
Thank you. Okay. So, thank you. Thank you much. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. Let's come back in. My name is Arthur Zients. I'm the president of the Mind and Life Institute, and it's been a wonderful event. We've all just had the chance to not just witness, but also participate in, and we're going to finish this day's work with a panel discussion, which is actually going to be driven mostly by your questions posed to one or other of these panelists, but then they'll also be able to take up your questions together. We've really had a very rich set of presentations, both by the panelists who are here. I think you now know them all, so I won't take time by reintroducing everybody. But I'd like to go right to the questions I know many of you have been wanting to ask. Do we have microphones for people? They're being gotten, or are they down here? You got them already? There's Tom. Okay. So let's just open it up for comments and questions, particularly questions to those who are up here. There's a question back and about halfway up, gentleman in the brown shirt, then I'll come down here.
Hello, my name's Tucker from the University of Arizona. My question's about Dr. Holland's talk this morning on dissemination. What I was wondering about is there's certain characteristics of good science, that it's conservatively interpreted, that it's detailed. And in dissemination, we're trying to move large groups of people to action. And the qualities of persuasive arguments tend to be the opposite. They tend to be emotional and conclusive. And I was wondering how you might all suggest for those of us who are coming into this field, trying to balance those two.
Trying to balance what two things?
Trying to balance on one hand good science with on the other persuasive argumentation, even though these often tend to be opposite qualities.
Well, I think it all starts with good science. And that's why I made the strong point that we didn't really have much to go with until we were able to say this is now evidence-based, and we indeed have treatment guidelines. So with that in place, I feel a little better about trying to be more persuasive. But how do you do that then? This means getting to key people. The tack we're taking is to try to train people in all of these oncology practices. Now that there's a stick saying you have to do this by 2015, we hope to get one or two people from various practices to come for training programs, and then to be able to develop a network of people helping one another. So it's a kind of effort to organize and network in a way that we can get these points across. So, you know, a persuasive argument by itself won't go very far, but I think that if you can get key people in key spots and get them then to start getting the word out in their own setting, so they'll be more believable than someone coming in from the outside. So it's a kind of stepwise progress. But it's a good question, and I thank you.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to speak to that question? All right.
Interventions that you're trying to roll out in the community or in workplaces, for example, require finding the right stakeholders and often a lot of persuasion, appealing to whatever it is that motivates them the most. So you have to bring the evidence to bear on the points that will matter to whoever is making the decision about putting a particular policy in place, and that will differ by different organizations, by different communities. So people tend not to be motivated necessarily just by knowing that something is going to be good. They're motivated by something that matters to them, and appealing to that is, I think, important.
Great. Let's go over to the other side here, Jeff.
Thanks. His Holiness talked about a non-sectarian approach to doing work, and I know I heard him talking about interest in bringing Hindu thought, Qigong as well. And so have we thought about integrating in the different potential practices into studies that you all are working on? I'm not trying to compete or compare, one's better than the other, but actually just integrating them in, saying there could be the same application or the same result, or even together they might be better. So could you talk about that in perspective and work?
Richie,
I know it's
you
hard to
wanna
get an
speak to that?
fMRI and do yoga, but
Thank you for the question. It's an interesting and good question. I think that from my perspective, one of the really important things is the recognition that if you look at the dirty laundry of all our studies and look at the error bars, one of the things that you inevitably must conclude is that one size does not fit all. And there's a lot of variation in how individuals respond to the kinds of interventions that we've been talking about. And I think that one of the important goals for science as it's going forward in this area is to more specifically study the relation between individual differences, what a person brings to the table, so to speak, and the kinds of contemplative interventions that may be most efficacious for that kind of person. There's a little bit in the contemplative traditions that we can glean notions about that, but I think that we also need to approach it from a scientific perspective, and some of the methods that you describe may be more effective for certain kinds of people than for other kinds of people, and this is just something that we critically need to find out more about. There are, I know of a few research efforts that have just recently been launched where one of the byproducts of the work is to create a simple toolbox that will enable a clinician, for example, to assess an individual's individual differences on a number of cognitive and affective characteristics so that the clinician can more rationally prescribe, if you will, a particular kind of contemplative intervention based upon a real knowledge of those starting individual differences. And a related point, if I could just add one other thing, one of the things we really don't know, and I think that this is a kind of knowledge that some groups probably have not wanted to know, which is that once people learn a particular practice, if you look a year, I'm talking now about beginners, if you look, for example, a year out, what percentage of them are still practicing regularly? We really have preciously little data on that, and my suspicion is that a significant percentage of them are not continuing to practice, primarily because, or at least in part because, they may have started with a method that may not be optimally suited for them.
Just to add to what Rishi said, Jeff, is like, for having exposed to this scientific inquiry for almost like another 12 years, I realized that there are many factors that you want to be sure to ascertain. First, what over time, how, if a practitioner has done 10,000 hours or 60,000 hours, what the differences are. And then, the kind of practice. Every single meditation has a different brain signature. I mean, focused attention will be completely different from compassion. So it's already very complicated. I mean, even logistically, because you need at least 15 to 20 long-term practitioners who have done 10 to 60,000 hours to bring them from the Himalayas or from somewhere, and bring them in the lab and then do all the studies. It takes years. I mean, and then the idea in the beginning was that let's hope that other labs will take the same task with Christian mystics, with Hindu yogis, with even within Buddhism, with Zen meditators, with Samatha meditators, with Tibetan meditators. But then you have to do a complete, rigorous study with each of those. Now the idea of bringing one Hindu practitioner with one Tibetan and then do them please meditate on compassion is just result in complete confusion, because then the first person experience will be quite different. And so I think the reason is purely that very few researchers from 10 years ago were motivated enough to undertake those long studies, and those other ones are more than welcome, but it will require a serious extended long-term effort to have some kind of data that makes sense.
So if I could just follow up on both what Richie and Matthew said. We're now in year 9 of our pilot study of a 3-month retreat. And I think it's very easy to say, assess this practice or assess that practice. But the word this practice, even within a given tradition, will differ as it's implemented within a single practitioner and between practitioners. So we report instructions, but we actually have very little data on the phenomenological side, the first person side, and its flux of change within the short term, near term, and long term. So these are early days for this kind of a comparison. And the comparison, I think what Richie said at the beginning, people are drawn to certain practices for very complex reasons which we barely understand. And so you can't really do a randomized design and really get a naturalistic observation of the consequences of these practices, particularly because of the other factors that we began to talk about in the session with His Holiness.
I'm going to make a very brief comment from the Western mystical tradition of hypnosis. And that is, these comments are right on, and we measure hypnotizability, many of us, not all of us do. It's about there's about a 0.6 correlation between treatment response with hypnosis for pain and treatment outcome. And we know that there are some people who are very responsive and some who aren't. And I think it'd be wonderful to begin to look at the overlap and lack of overlap with their use of other traditions like mindfulness as well.
You want to say what 0.6 means?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the correlation, what it means is about a third of the variance in outcome is accounted for by hypnotizability. So you can make a pretty decent prediction of who's going to respond and who isn't, just knowing how hypnotizable they are, and we can measure that in 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Tish, did you have, it's all right? Jean?
Yeah, I'll try.
Up here?
Prepare for this.
Okay. Yes, put your hand up right there, Tom. Third row.
I don't think this was mentioned, but there was a lot of material covered. And this is, I think, more directed towards the medical sphere. And I didn't hear anything mentioned in this vein, but is it ever possible that a doctor or a therapist would walk into a room not having read anything about the patient and make a pure perception between yourself and that patient? Because I work as a movement therapist, and I've done that with every patient. I don't read their medical history. I first make my contact, and I've had small miracles happen in that, because I'm not going in with a preconception. So I am not projecting onto them that already old story. And because of that, new things can happen. And I've seen it over and over again in very severe cases of people that everyone gave up on. And I just put that there because, you know, it's not a question, but it's a reality. And I didn't hear that come up in any way. I don't know that that ever is allowed in the medical field.
Let's ask. Let's see. Anybody want to comment on this suggestion?
I think that's a privilege that we don't have when we're working with someone who's physically ill. Where I come from, I would be very worried to go in and talk to someone if I didn't know a little bit about the nature of their illness, because I might say something that was way out of line with what their situation was. So the better prepared I am for what I may encounter, the better job I think I can do. It's very different. And if someone's physically healthy, I might risk that. But I wouldn't risk it with people who are physically ill, because it's too easy to make a mistake and going in unprepared.
I mean, in this case, if I knew someone had cancer.
I think we need to get to that person that's up here.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Would you pass the mic back to Tom, and then we'll take the person who's behind you, Tom? The person who's standing right there.
Hi, I'm Mickey Lemley, and I know some of you have been interacting with His Holiness for many years, and I wondered if you could just say how those interactions have affected you personally and the direction of your work because of that relationship.
Richie, you're the longest standing.
Well, there are so many things to say. It's hard to know where to start. You know, I think that many people who come in contact with His Holiness feel that he really brings out the best in everyone. The very first time I met His Holiness in 1992, I wasn't quite sure how I would begin the conversation, and while waiting, I was extremely anxious, and I'm not someone who's prone to excessive anxiety, but I nearly had a panic attack, and then within 15 seconds of being in his presence, it just completely dissipated. And I think that, you know, that's, many people have reported those kinds of things. I also find that as a student of emotion, I'm struck by His Holiness's emotions. And particularly, I'm struck by how extraordinarily rapid he makes transitions among emotions. I've seen him cry in sadness at some tragic news, and then just like that, burst out laughing. And it's a quality which I think one of the things that we study in the laboratory is this notion of, for lack of a more technical term, we call stickiness. And stickiness refers to the kind of spillover of emotion so that it colors the next moment, and a person can get stuck in a kind of affective perseveration, if you will. And there's a kind of fluidity to His Holiness that I think has affected many of us, and it's, you know, it's remarkable. It's something you don't see very often in adults. You see it in infants in a certain way, but of course in infants you don't see it with the accompanying wisdom. And so I think it's really something that I have been touched by, and I guess I'll just end and then let others chime in that you know, I feel very much like my life and my career have been deeply touched and affected by my interactions with him, and I have been inspired to dedicate as much time as possible to work that I think will help relieve suffering and be of some benefit. And that motivation has only increased over time with the opportunities that we've had to interact with His Holiness. So I just can't express enough gratitude for these precious opportunities. So thank you for that, Nikki.
I might, you know, I'm trying to find the right word. Encouragement doesn't do it, but it's the closest I can come to. But, you know, you hear the results here sort of all in a nice package, but I can assure you the path along the way has not been strewn with roses. I've been attacked for daring to put women who are dying of breast cancer together in the same room because I'll just demoralize them and make them worse. And many years ago, it was in the, I don't know, the 80s or 90s, I presented to His Holiness and asked him why, from his perspective, he thought it might help rather than harm patients to have them confront death. And he said, I have a very busy travel schedule. And I thought, we're not communicating here, you know. And as you see, he speaks very good English. And he said, I get anxious about it. And when I do, I call over one of my assistants, and he tells me what I'm doing for the next 3 days, and I feel better. That's the way we Buddhists feel about death. We make it familiar, and it becomes less frightening. So he got it exactly. And that was very encouraging to me, because I was still dealing with a lot of people who knew, didn't just think, but knew that I was harming patients by doing what I was doing. And if I'm convinced of anything out of 40 years of doing this research, it's that it helps people to face mortality together. And he gave me tremendous encouragement from this very different and very long tradition to keep doing what I was doing. So I'm very grateful for that.
Cliff?
So Richie would have met the Dalai Lama in 1990 had not a medical situation in his family caused a particular moment where he could not go to Dharamsala on 3 weeks' notice. And he asked me to go in his stead. and my life has not been the same since that request. This was for the third Mind and Life meeting. And what I found in having this first close encounter with His Holiness was a quality of clarity and stability of attention in the presence of ongoing kindness that I'd never experienced in my life. One could actually, this was my fantasy perhaps, but I could feel the ideas be held, be examined, and be situated, and then the communication continued. And the suppleness of that process really became a kind of touchstone for human potential for me. And the community of monks and teachers and lay people that were gathered at that scene in that time was quite magical. And rooming with Francisco Varela, it was really a combined deep opportunity for growth. So we began a project that actually gave rise to a field research project that Richie and Alan Wallace and others were involved in. The pictures of that have floated around over the years. And that became the antecedents for the study that I actually presented here. So in many ways, the combination of the dialogues with Mind and Life and the stream of research that emerged from it has been defining for my career. I was in graduate school at Einstein in neuroscience, and when I first got involved, I was nearly screamed at by my department chair. There are people dying of AIDS, and you're measuring the Dalai Lama's brainwaves. I didn't have the presence of mind to say, well, part of why they were dying is because of their inability to deal with their own cravings for a situation that was completely preventable. So I think that will be a thread throughout my life.
I'm going to, before I go to the next question, is there a Varela Award winner in the audience? I wonder if you, well, yeah, okay, we actually have quite a few. And I wonder if I might just ask two of you, Tish and, is that Philip? Philip, would you just maybe we'll start with you, Tish, down here, and then we'll bring the mic to you, Philip. Now let me explain just a little bit. The Varela Awards have been initiated by the Mind and Life Institute. Anyone who's attended the Summer Research Institute, where about 150 of us gather together, and many young scholars, primarily young scholars, but also others. And then if they've been recently attending, then they can apply for a fellowship, for an award, a modest sum of money, but has made a lot possible. So maybe you could say just a little bit about your own relationship, not so much to the Dalai Lama in this case, but in a kind of second order, effect where.
Yeah, I think I'm a good example of that actually. When was the first award? 2004, 2005? Anybody remember?
It was about 9 years ago.
So it was either 2004 or 2005.
It was issued in 2004, and the award was given out toward the end of 2004, beginning of 2005.
So I was in that first cohort, and I was working on the Cultivating Emotional Balance project at UCSF, which is, I could go into it, but my interest in that study was, can this mindfulness-based emotion skills training help improve student outcomes and improve classroom climate? And so I got the Varela Award to do a little pilot study to look at the teachers who were involved in the Cultivating Emotional Balance project and observe their classrooms and see if there were any differences in the classrooms. And there was, it was a pilot study. There was some suggestion of that. I went on and did a bigger study with more funding. But what we found in the second study of Cultivating Emotional Balance again was that this emotion skills part of the program needed to be more contextualized. And I actually learned that from working with Paul Ekman, that the emotion skills needed to be targeted to the stressors that existed in that context. So we developed a new program. I worked at the Garrison Institute, and we developed a new program that we call Care for Teachers. And we've been developing that for a few years, and we've had 2 federal grants to study that program. First, we found that we did repeat the effects that we found on the teachers in the CEB project. We improved their well-being, it's another talk, but we didn't have enough data to look at the classroom in that one because we didn't have enough money. Well, we just got, in January we got a large grant from the Department of Education to do a cluster randomized controlled trial in the New York City schools, and we just finished our data collection in our first wave, and we're looking at teachers, classrooms, and kids. So we will have finally getting to that point, but this is 8 years later? So yeah, it was a very good investment, and I'm very grateful for that head start.
Maybe we'll do just one more, and there are roughly 100 such awardees that have received, and I think we calculated something like $15 million of follow-on funding could be tracked back, and Tish is just an example of such a wonderful career. And they're now $5 million from you? Okay. Philip, you want to just say a word about?
Sure. Philippe Golden, Stanford University. Actually, it was really fundamental because I was there the first summer at Garrison, first Varela Award, and that actual award, ready for this, served as the basis over the last several years for 6 grants. More than $10 million. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 R01s, many different. And now doing cognitive behavioral therapy versus MBSR, compassion, Vipassana, chronic pain patients, social anxiety, 45 papers.
How many papers?
45.
45 papers, okay.
And many more coming. So that actually, it sounded like a little thing, the Varela Award, but in reality...
It was $10,000, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
In those days,
I think it was 10,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that literally served as a basis for catapulting the last 9 years or whatever at Stanford and translating that into, and now I have a lab of like 15 people and higher meditation teachers and blah, blah, blah. And also, but it's not only that, but also obviously, hopefully, just serving as an inspiration for many younger people to see that they can go into this field and be successful at any level they want, and that we don't have to rely on rich donors, but we can actually get the federal government, our tax money, and translate that back into research that makes a difference.
That's a fabulous 2 examples. And this is all in a field that didn't exist even 12 or 13 years ago, and I think it's just a testimony to the excitement which young people, especially young scholars, have come to this area with, and one can only imagine. We thought it was like 15 million overall between the 2 of you. Okay, we're already there, so we're gonna have to change our figures. But forget the stock market. This is where you want to put your money. Okay, let's go into the back just to, I can't quite, there's a gentleman, yes, I can't quite make out who it is, but can we get a microphone here in the middle aisle? Is that possible? Okay.
Thank you. I have 2 quick questions. One is for Dr. Davidson. I was wondering if, maybe this was said, but I'm not sure, if there's any study that has looked at purely attention regulation training, whether that by itself leads to emotional regulation or not, without any other kind of compassion training attached to it. My second question, maybe for Matthew, is, we all know people who can be quite unpleasant people for everybody around, but they can be quite satisfied and content themselves.
Personality disorders.
And there I remember studies from years ago demonstrating that people who let out their aggression actually fare better in terms of parameters like blood pressure, hypertension, than people who keep it in. But I'm curious to know if how how you would think of that from a Buddhist perspective. Is it really possible that there are people who somehow can make life miserable for everybody around them, but can be healthy, live long, and be quite content themselves?
Let's start with the second question, Mathieu.
Well, they are successful psychopaths. This is well known. This has been studied. They are all the characteristics of psychopaths, but they succeed they find a niche in this modern society to be quite successful. So the fact of being successful in reasons doesn't show you are a good human being. But there are several criteria to the flourishing of your spiritual practice, if you have one. So maybe you are not speaking about meditators. First of all, you must somehow see the transformation slowly happening in yourself. If you wake up one morning or after a meditation and say, "No, I got it," if universal compassion, and wait for a few hours. But if slowly, like the arm of a clock that's moved, doesn't seem to move, but when you look from time to time, it has moved over the months and years, you see a change. So that's a good sign. The second thing is that, of course, there should be interpersonal validation of that. If you say, "Oh, my meditation is fantastic," and people say, "Well, he's such a pain, this guy," as ever, something wrong with your practice. You have been wasting your time. And also in the case of a real practitioner or long-term practitioner, there's a relation with a wise, compassionate teacher who can, unmask your own projections and imagination about how great a practitioner you are. And sometimes the role of such a teacher will be to point out, however compassionate a person might be, who will be merciless for your fancies and your ego. There's no reason why you should be, polite with your, what's not helping you to progress.
Looks like we have a couple more.
Yeah, so just on this point, one of the other issues related to your question that Mathieu just addressed is sometimes people come to me and they say they really want to do research and they're not well funded, they have self-report instruments, that's all they have. I say, give it to their spouse. Give the questionnaires to their partners. Let the partners be the informants about how they're doing. And rather than asking a person whether he or she is getting more compassionate with whatever training they're getting, ask their spouse how they're doing. That's where the rubber meets the road. And so I think that it's a simple way to broaden the kind of evidence base. And unfortunately, we have very little data of that kind at this point. A little bit, but not a lot.
One image. We say it's very easy to be a good practitioner where you are sitting in the sun with a full belly, but it's when meeting difficult circumstances that the practitioner is put on the scale.
So just to follow up on what Richie just said, is,
You're on.
in the Shamana project with Baljinder Sadra and Susan Bauer-Wu, we're actually going to ask this, we're going to do this second person perspective project on the practitioners that we were assessing, that I presented data, and now it's 6 years since the data has been collected, and we're going to be looking at close other and someone one sees frequently, but who's a business acquaintance or a coworker or a colleague, and we're going to do that in terms of interviews as well as questionnaires. And so we're going to have a robust second-person perspective and actually be able to relate that specifically to the trajectories of change that the practitioners show.
Yeah. There was the first question which had to do with attention.
Yeah, so on the first question, the question was about whether attention training by itself produces emotional consequences, essentially. I'm not aware of any data explicitly on a non-contemplative kind of attention training that has systematically looked at the affective consequences of the attention training. There is some work on mindfulness practices that emphasize, I would say, the attentional component, but probably are not purely attentional, where affective changes have been reported. And then there are studies where individuals go through a complex mixed intervention that includes both attention and affective components, and scientists have looked at changes with that. But I think the question is a very interesting one. There are data, though, that bear on it, looking at individual differences in certain parameters of attention and executive function, like working memory capacity, and looking at an individual's capacity to regulate their emotions. And there have been some studies which have reported relations between these aspects of individual differences in cognitive function and individual differences in aspects of emotion regulation, with the basic notion that emotion regulation and cognitive control both may share some overlapping neural resources.
Just follow up briefly on that, because there's some data from the aging field that sort of reinforces that point. So I mentioned earlier this morning that there's a tendency as people get older to become more, have better emotional well-being and potentially regulate their emotions better. But in some work by Mara Mather and her colleagues, they found that it's only those older adults who show higher cognitive control measured through an attention task, typically, that are showing that pattern.
Thank you. Why don't we come around, Mindy? Oh, you're gonna, let's go around up to the top. I haven't gotten it. I'll come back to you in just a minute. Yeah. Up, keeps your hand up. There you go, right there. Yes, and then we'll come eventually way back. But.
Hello. I help to administer a leadership program for university students, and we merge contemplation and innovation for transformative social change. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is the process of healthy decision-making under stress. And so I'm interested in a lot of the work that was done around stress, but also some of the work, Dr. Nielsen, that you were just describing, and wondering whether you can help me to understand and help us to understand how to make a practical application in this field, perhaps, of leadership, and helping them to what science could we use to support the idea that healthy decision-making and contemplation and leadership are all kind of intertwined together. I don't know if I articulated that well enough.
I mean, perhaps just remind you of what I covered, but maybe rather rapidly. The studies I referred to on the enlarging the hippocampus with regular exercise were preceded by the same group, this is Arthur Kramer and colleagues at the University of Illinois, by a study of the effects of aerobic exercise on executive function, so decision making, showing that again an aerobic program that's sort of like an hour a day for over a period of time for somebody who was normally more sedentary actually would enhance that executive function, the ability to stop one thing, move to another, cognitive flexibility, decision making, and would increase blood flow in a number of areas, the cortex, prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, and so on. And then it was followed later by the study I referred to on the hippocampus enlargement, and then, of course, as Liz Nielsen covered, the experience core study using, again, the prefrontal cortex showed, again, benefits. So physical activity, not becoming a marathon runner, but regular physical activity. I mean, some people have introduced the stand-up desk. You may have read about it, the treadmill. People just simply moving around. Don't go to the gym just in the morning or just in the evening, but move around during the day, which is very important. So there are many aspects of physical activity that can be incorporated into a person's life that seem to sort of loosen up the brain plasticity-wise so that other things can take hold.
Thank you. Let's promise to come down here and then up there.
Hi, thank you. This is my first meeting at the Mind Life Institute, so I appreciate the opportunity to witness what's going on. Despite Philip's success in his grants, I see a bigger issue with NIH funding. Limited funding, smaller scores needed for to support the work. Based on the 2007 review of the science of meditation, it looked like it was more of a scattershot of the studies that we're doing. With Mind Life as a specific entity working together, is there a strategy or a possibility of a strategy of outlining a matrix of studies that would be needed to actually fill in gaps, to actually put together the science of meditation in a way that would meet the meta-analysis requirements usually in science?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that meta-analysis question. Richie, this is probably needs to be thrown to you.
Jeff, I think it's a wonderful suggestion, and I would love to enlist your help in taking you up on that. I mean, I think that it's something that really needs to be done, and while occasionally in our discussions in various Mind and Life meetings, we've talked about things like that, we actually haven't taken it on as a project of Mind and Life, and I think this is an example potentially of something Mind and Life can do in partnership with one or more NIH agencies, particularly the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which is the agency within NIH that is supporting a fair amount of research related to meditation. So,
great,
thank you.
Great. You know, just a comment. This was touched on before. We've, I think, just opened up this resource of the contemplative life, and it's a rich and varied set of practices, and one can only expect that as one becomes more sophisticated, more discerning, like just as in the pharmaceutical industry, you know, there's no panacea. We begin to realize that for particular individuals within particular contexts, working with particular kinds of necessities, health-wise, educationally, what have you, then particular kinds of practices will be generally better suited to them. And there may be a kind of ground state of MBSR, which has a very powerful, across-the-board kind of effect, but there may be also targeted kinds of practices. And I think disaggregating, becoming more sophisticated in the way we evaluate those practices and so on, all of that is something that needs to be done systematically. So I think we're really at the beginning of all that, but Mind and Life hasn't taken that on. One last one on this side, I promised, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, can you guys hear? Good. Okay. Thank you all very much for all the knowledge that we've experienced today. I am a yoga teacher and a mother, and I found it very interesting that there's been a lot spoken to the child and then to those that are older. And I actually wonder exactly what we're talking about when we speak about older, because I work with a lot of people throughout the range. And I think that, yeah, I've definitely seen, and it's known that children are very responsive to change and open to change. And I found in my work that definitely people who are sick and older are also open to change. And even if they're 55 or whatever it is, and I don't consider that necessarily older, if they have a terrible Parkinson's disease or something like that, again, they might be more open to change than your average normal person that may be looking for change, but kind of starts being open, and then when they start to see the reality and confront the issues in the mirror and the ego, kind of have this adverse reaction and run. So is that enough of a concrete question to be answered?
Yeah, you have to be a little more specific about the question itself.
So, okay, first of all, how would you address those that are between 30 and, let's say, 70 in terms of where they fit into these different sciences that you've been talking about, whether it's the emotional ability to change or on the scale of, you know, aging, how
midlife plasticity?
basically, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that the sort of categories of aging have changed as the population has gotten older. And what it means to be older can be sort of psychologically older, biologically older. I think biological age is more sort of the predictor of many of the psychological changes you see with aging. So when people realize they're coming close to their end of life, whether that's in your culture 55 or whether it's 95, I think then you might see the same sorts of psychological changes. In our culture, you know, we have these culturally marking points, like 65 is retirement age, and so some people tend to cluster older adults after that, and then we have the older old that have their own special issues. But the midlife period has tended not to be studied so much, and I think increasingly, whenever we at the National Institute on Aging invite experts together for recommendations for research, they always say, you need to start looking at this process of aging earlier in the lifespan. You need to start looking at the factors in people's midlife period that are impacting how they develop and what trajectories of aging they take. And even more so, people are pushing us even further back. So I think that there are special characteristics of the midlife period that are culturally defined because it's rife with many responsibilities, both raising children as well as dealing with one's own aging and maybe aging parents, that create, in our culture, special challenges. So aging in a way is both culturally defined, biologically defined, and these both will have impacts on the psychological and behavioral challenges people will face.
Thank you. If we can go over to this side over here on the opposite side. Put your hand up, please, right on the aisle there, right next to you, Mindy.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I had a question. I guess for everyone on the panel, as research scientists and educators and clinicians and practitioners, I was just curious what your thoughts are on what aspects specifically on this practice are having these effects. I know that a lot of the research is validating these very ancient practices, and I was curious on what your thoughts were on the specific aspects of the training or the specific aspects of the practice that are having these effects.
Okay, so trying to tease out specifically the magic ingredient, so to speak. What part of the practice is, what aspect of the practice is effective?
To quote His Holiness, I don't know.
That's the research agenda.
No, more seriously, these are issues we're all thinking about and trying to study. They're very tough problems, and I think that anyone who, it's just a question that we don't have an answer to really at this point in time.
Okay, still up on this side. Tom, right next to you on your left. Tom, we'll go to the first, on that side, and then we'll go to the other side.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you all for your work, and I was struck by some of the findings on gender today. So I wonder if some of the panelists, we heard from David Spiegel, Richie showed a slide that showed significant gender differences in early adversity and connectivity. And I'm just wondering, as the field of contemplative science moves forward, how might we be thinking about gender in this work, or how might some of you already be thinking about it?
Who would like to take that?
I can start. I think that it's a hugely important issue that we have not paid very much attention to. If you look at the research literature, for example, looking at the prevalence of anxiety and depression across development, you see that there are no gender differences until puberty. And once puberty occurs, those gender differences are dramatic. And the incidence of anxiety and depressive symptoms in females is double that in males after puberty. And I think that this is an incredibly important fact and offers, I think, a real opportunity for understanding more about first why that occurs, and secondly, to determine whether the preventative application of contemplative strategies earlier in development may help minimize that gender difference post-puberty. We do not know the answer to that question now, and that's a tractable question which I think is worthy of investigation.
Yeah, Bruce. Please.
perspective, I've been interested in sex differences and how they've developed for a long time. One thing that's clear is that the brain, the entire brain, is a target of sex hormones through various mechanisms, and that both estrogens and androgens and even corticoids produce effects on the brain that have very subtle differences in the wiring of the brain that result in differences in how the male and female brain react to the environment. So it's a nature-nurture environment epigenetic question starting very early in life. The brain circuitry is subtly altered, and then the experiences build upon that. So the best way of thinking about sex differences in brain function and behavior, to quote colleague Peggy McCarthy at the University of Maryland, is that men and women, males and females, do most of the same things with maybe slight differences in which gender is better and so on. But they differ in the strategies that they use to do these because of these subtle differences that may be present all over the brain. And so when it comes then to applying it to something like we're talking about today, one has to realize that just as there are individual differences among all of us, there are also perhaps are somewhat different tendencies among men and women, and how they then deal with this, how they use this, how they respond to it.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
One last one up.
Because I have primarily done support group work with women with breast cancer, I got interested in. I'm always asked, well, what about men? And they also participate in groups, but they're much more agenda-driven. It's not, Mary, you look sad today. We're supposed to be talking about emotions here, and you're not. It turns out in the studies Dr. Nielsen showed, linking social support with health, there's a big gender difference. The kind of social support that is good for a man's survival is marriage. The kind of social support that's good for a woman's survival is not marriage. It's relationships with other women. So it leads me to the sad conclusion that having a relationship with a woman does your health a lot of good regardless of your own gender. And having a relationship with a man does your health no good at all regardless of your own gender. So, so I think along with Dr. McEwen's comments about effects of sex hormones on the brain, we need to understand more about the effects of social support and gender.
I think this is maybe a good segue. Unfortunately, we have to begin to wrap up. A good segue to some final comments. Our banner for the day is Next Steps. And I wonder if I might ask the panel to speak to this question. All right, we've spoken about work that has been done, some extraordinary results of your own life's work, and questions drawing from the audience indicate also their engagement with these same issues. Where do you see this field going? What are some next steps?
Well, I would hope that some of the wisdom and experience here will percolate into the mainstream of medical practice. I hope that the idea that contemplating death and making it a part of your life is a good way to prepare for the rest of your life for successful aging will be something that medicine and the way we practice takes seriously. I would hope that we will understand more about how cognitive control and also the ability to change states of consciousness helps improve people's ability to manage stress and live their lives more fully. There's a wealth of information and wisdom that is here and available, but we have made very bad use of it in the way we treat people, and I hope that will change.
Thank you.
Cliff? I want to hearken back to the first question of this session, which had to do with persuasion versus evidence. And I think it's important for people to also appeal to what really feels deeply true about the nature of their own life. And, people do heroic efforts in the absence of randomized controlled trials because of their own commitment. I mean, we don't actually have evidence if we didn't have scientists and practitioners and clinicians who had very strong hunches that this is the right way to go. The nature of science is a rigorous commitment to one's perception of the truth, because the truth doesn't exist as an objective reality. It's always a moving target. So I think it's really important to begin to pay attention from a research perspective to the other things that Al we began talking about with His Holiness, because the meaning that you bring, the purpose, we had this repeated appearance of a sense of purpose in life. And that purpose could be widely manifold, and it doesn't have to have a contemplative component. It could, I'm going to garden, and I have such a deep appreciation. This is your beholding term. There is so much that doesn't need to fit inside a box of meditation. And as we heard so beautifully from Matthew, meditation qua meditation dissolves into an effort of familiarization and cultivation. So maybe my little gardening is an appropriate metaphor. And then finally, I think this question of individual differences has got to be deeply wrestled with. And there's an interface between promoting policy and appreciating individual differences. And that's a delicate balance. And I leave that up to all of us and many more to solve.
Thank you, Cliff. Matthew?
Yeah, I think there will be a few things that will happen, hopefully. First, more longitudinal studies. Of course, we are a bit impatient. I'm one of the first one to be impatient to see results, a few days after we went in MRI machine, but both with long-term practitioners and then with people who have gone through the MBSR training and to the loving kindness training for 6 months or whatever, and see after quite a few years. And then in terms of the intervention, like in education, based on the secular ethics and which are informed by the knowledge that comes from this collaboration between scientists and contemplatives, first they will be maybe able to refine more the kind of intervention that we can do, and then as it's taken seriously as a valuable contribution, then we might be to extend the number of the size of the study, and on thousands and thousands of children then it could really become a big contribution. And as you said, in the medical field, introducing this notion that you could possibly, train, help to alleviate burnout, to loving kindness training, or all this. I think slowly, in all those fields, there are something that will be found to be really useful, and they hopefully might become mainstream, and while the basic research will continue. So that will be a good agenda.
Richie?
Well, I think that there are many important things on the agenda. There's a whole basic research component. For example, looking at the impact of these practices on epigenetic processes, which we're just beginning to learn more about and use in human models. And I think that we're going to learn a lot from that over the next few years. On the more translational or applied side, I think there's a real need for much larger sample size studies that will ultimately be much more convincing. And in the healthcare area, one of the things that I've been talking a lot about is the need for a very large-scale study to look at the impact of the practice of the kinds of strategies that we've been discussing on healthcare utilization and on prescription drug costs. If we can show that the practice of meditation and the contemplative practices more generally result in a decrease in healthcare utilization, it will have, I think, very dramatic effects and very quickly. Those data, though, don't yet exist, and we need a very large multi-site study to collect those data. It needs to be done extremely well, and I think it's going to be incredibly important, and if the data come out like some of us think they might, I think it will have enormous implications and be translated very, very quickly into policy. Similarly, in the education area, I think we need large-scale studies that, in addition to our interesting experimental measures, we need to look at the bottom line that educators care about, for better or for worse. And we know that a cognate field, social and emotional learning, there are data showing in a recent meta-analysis that involved an aggregate of more than 280,000 school children across the United States, that social and emotional learning actually produces a significant, robust gain on standardized test scores from interventions that are completely non-cognitive. And I think that if we had similar data for the application of contemplative practices in education, people will start to pay much more attention. And finally, let me just end by saying, I also think, and we started talking about this toward the end of this session with His Holiness, we need research on non-meditation based contemplative practices, which don't exist. There literally is, I think, essentially no research on this. For example, aspirations, which are very much a part of contemplative traditions. We don't know what the role of aspirations might be in actually altering intentions and literally altering brain states, which can have potentially salubrious effects. This is something that I think is totally tractable. It also is something that is very accessible to everyone because it potentially involves minimal practice and may actually make a difference.
Great. Jimmy, we'll end with you.
I'd like to speak about where we're headed. I think that there's a stigma about cancer, which is a little less than it was. There is an enormous stigma about anything mental. People think, oh, you think I'm crazy if you bring up you need some help. The word psychiatric, the word mental is still frightening to people. And I think that gets attached to whatever we've talked about here, the kind of interventions that we know are helpful. And so I'm all for more research, but it doesn't always, you do the research, you think they'd say, oh, well, great, there's the data, we'll go use that. It doesn't happen because I think there are these attitudinal barriers. And I don't like to be crass, but I really think that we have to market this. I hate the word branding and marketing, but I've been trying to figure out what's the reason we can't get these points across. So I think that that's a piece of it, that the Mind and Life Institute could probably help enormously by focusing on this. Get a PR person in. How do we market this area? That's what we've just done, and my goodness, they have a jargon all their own, and I'm learning this area, but we don't know that kind of thing. You know, we think we'll do the research and everything will be fine. It isn't. 30 years I've got of experience to tell you that I thought naively 30 years ago, well, if we do the research, that's all we have to do. You know, we show this works and everything will change. Wrong. So, and that's exactly, I think, what you're experiencing. So I would say take a little different tact and use the Institute. Also, if you can show something is cost effective. It's a crass world. Show you save money and they will buy it. And our studies don't usually put cost in them, but it's a critical piece because that's what will convince stakeholders.
Listen, if you're looking for a job, I know Jason has a place for you.
I know nothing about this, but I'm trying to learn.
There's an organization in Cambridge, Mass. called Frameworks, which does exactly what you're talking about. I mentioned it to Richie. They are an advertising agency for good causes, and it's very important how you frame words and ideas for the broad public and for policymakers.
Is there anything else that you had? You raised your hand as if you wanted.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we used to have a put down for the things we're talking about to say, it's all in your head. But it is in your head. It's in your brain, and I think we've...
Let me just say a first word of thanks to all of you for joining us for the whole day. Give us a round of applause. Thank you. You know, and one can't help but say also that as far as we've come in these 15 years or 20 years, however long it's been, it's clear that we're just really at the very beginning. You know, Aung San Suu Kyi was once asked, you know, do you believe in evil? And she, echoing, I think, Buddha's teaching, said, no, I don't believe in evil, but I do believe in ignorance. I do believe in ignorance. And I think science is there to dispel ignorance, but also these practices are there to really work to the root sources of suffering, which are the mistaken conceptions we have of ourselves and our world. And so not only are these interventions, these contemplative practices, I think, of great therapeutic value, but they really allow us to do the kinds of deep research. I won't even call it basic, you know, I'll just call it deep research that allow us to really tackle the deepest sources of our misunderstandings about ourselves, about each other, and about our world. So I think we're really only at the beginning, and some of that deepness is probably way down or way up, and we'll look forward to the next few decades of doing that work together. So thank you again for coming.